Hello, hello, 1, 2, 3. Hello.
చైర్లు ప్రాపర్గా నేను హ్యాండిల్ చేయలేదు. చైర్లు కట్ జరగదు. స్పీకర్ కూర్చుంటే పవర్ లాక్ అవుతుంది.
Good afternoon, all. Jai Bhim to everyone. It is an honor and privilege to stand before you today as we gather to celebrate the birth anniversary of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, who is a towering intellect, a great social reformer, and a principal architect of the Indian Constitution. The three principles that he envisioned, liberty, equality, and fraternity, has played a crucial role in the formation of modern Indian states. As we reflect on his legacy, we are also reminded that celebrating Babasaheb Ambedkar is not just a passive act, but an active, ongoing commitment that we all show today in this hall. Interestingly, one of India's leading public intellectual on the Dalit movement, Anand Teltumde, in an interview with Frontline, says that Baba Sahib is an icon who is now wrongly worshipped by several political parties and ordinary people. He adds, Ambedkar had very progressive values which are being eclipsed by this veneration, which is very easy. You just hang up somebody's picture on the wall, garland it and forget it. That is not the case here in the EFLU. Okay. This observation indicates how there needs to be more work done to understand Ambedkar, especially in the world that we live in today. One way to that is it is engaged to discuss, especially in academic spaces like ours. Today we have eminent scholars who are here to grace the occasion we organized to the talk reading Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in 2025. With that spirit in mind, it gives me great pleasure to invite our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Nagalapalli Nagaraju, to the dais. I also invite Professor Krishna Swami on the dais, Honorable Vice Chancellor of National Law School of India University. I request Professor K. Satyanarayana to hand over a bouquet to our Honorable Vice Chancellor. And I also request Professor Srivani to hand over bouquet to Professor Krishna Swami. Now I would like to invite Srilata to hand over a bouquet to our liaison officer, Professor Bheemrao Rathod. I request all the dignitaries for the dais to uh, give the homage to the Babasaheb Ambedkar. Thank you, sir. It is an honor to introduce our today's guest, Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy, Vice Chancellor of National Law School of India University, Bangalore, and is also Secretary Treasurer of the Consortium of National Law University. He is a member of the Independent Oversight Board that makes content moderation decisions on Facebook and Instagram platforms. He is a co-founder and managing trustee of the Center Law and Policy Research that engages in law and policy research, social and governance, intervention and strategic impact litigation. I am the founder of the Supreme Court Observer, which is the most reliable guide to the work of the Indian Supreme Court. Previously, he was a director of the School of Policy and Governance and professor of law and politics at Azim Premji University, and his doctoral degree was from Oxford University, and he's a very prestigious awardee of Rhodes Scholar. He is the recipient of Infosys Prize in 2022 and in the humanities category. His current research focuses on constitutional law, the empirical analysis of legal politics and governance systems, and the regulations of new emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence and automated decision systems. His publications are very uh, important to engage all of us because he largely focused on the communities that we are talking today. The essay that he published, Dalits see the apex court's order on SC/ST Act as a dog whistle to destroy the law, and it was published in 2018. And his interesting book got published by Oxford University Press in 2009. The title of the book is Democracy and Constitutionalism in India. He has many publications in reputed journals, national and international, and today he is going to give us very enlightening speech on the Ambedkar in reading Ambedkar in 2025. I also take privilege in introducing our Honorable Vice Chancellor who is here today. Yes. So now I invite Professor Shamrao Rathod, Liaison Officer of SC/ST Cell, to give a welcome address. Thank you all.
Namaskar, good afternoon, and Jai Bhim to all. Respected dignitaries on the dais and off the dais, on behalf of ST/ST Cell, IFLO, I welcome our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor N. Nagarajuji, and our today's chief guest and speaker, Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy, Honorable Vice Chancellor of National Law School of India University, Bangalore. It is my privilege to welcome you, sir, and other dignitaries to this significant occasion as we gather to celebrate the 134th birth anniversary of Mahamanav Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, a visionary leader, a champion of social justice, and the principal architect of the Indian Constitution. I would like to say that Ambedkar legacy continues to inspire millions across the world. His relentless fight against caste discrimination, his advocacy for the right of marginalized communities, including Dalits, Adivasis, and other oppressed groups, and his emphasis on education, equality, and dignity remain deeply relevant today. Most of the times we speak about his contribution to the marginal, but we should also know that his thoughts on national security and our nation. His vision to build a modern India is immeasurable. Today's gathering is more than just a celebration. It is a representation of the values that Dr. Ambedkar stood for as we bring together leaders, scholars, and members of the downtrodden communities. Let us take this moment to reflect on his teaching and renew our commitment to building a just and inclusive society. I warmly welcome our esteemed guests and all participants who have joined us to share knowledge, experience, and vision. Your presence here strengthens our collective resolve to continue the journey towards equity and empowerment for all. I would like to put it in record that this is the first time in the university has come forward to celebrate birth anniversary officially. I was a bit hesitant in the beginning, but after I met our Honorable Vice Chancellor and discussed about the celebration, I felt happy because our Honorable Vice Chancellor said that it should be celebrated officially. He also said that Ambedkar contributed for all the citizens of this country. It is very rare to find such a dynamic visionary Vice Chancellor. Sir, we are honored to have here. I also want to express my sincere gratitude to our today's guest speaker, Professor Sudhir Krishna Swamiji, Honorable Vice Chancellor, NLSIU, Bangalore, for having been here in spite of his busy schedule and accepting our invitation to give a lecture on reading Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in 2025. Sir, we are privileged to have you here. Thank you very much. I also express my sincere gratitude to our registrar in charge, Professor K. Bheemrao, for his constant support and encouragement. He is not here, he is out of station for official work. Sir, I know all our participants are eagerly waiting in listening to you. Therefore, I do not want to take much time. So once again, I welcome to you and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bheemrao Rathur, for giving us a welcome address, in which you also mentioned, how Ambedkar actually changed millions of people's destiny. Thank you, sir. Without wasting much time, I know that the audience are eagerly waiting to listen to the speaker today. Now I invite Professor Krishna Swami to deliver his lecture today.
So good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to speak at the English and Foreign Languages University on the 135th birth anniversary of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Vice Chancellor N. Nagaraju reached out to me not so long ago with the request to speak at this commemorative event. I readily agreed, and I have two reasons which I think I should at least sketch in the outline. The first is that EFLU and its predecessor, the Central Institute of English, have pioneered an Indian approach to education in English and foreign languages. The scope and the intellectual breadth at EFLU, which embraces the study of language, literature, linguistics, and literary and cultural studies, have established a high standard in how we might teach and engage with languages. These achievements, which all of us are aware of, at least those of us invested in these kinds of academic questions are certainly aware of, show a path forward to universities like ours, the National Law School of India University, as we belatedly begin taking steps towards language education in a newly developed BA Honours degree that we launch in 2025. So we are approaching this question of language education, both for Indian languages and for English and foreign languages afresh. And so the opportunity to come here today to visit EFLU is an opportunity I couldn't miss to learn more about the work of the university in person and share this with my colleagues as we move forward. So that's my first motivation. As soon as I heard, I said I should be here. My second reason is more essentially connected to the theme and the topic of today's event. The Equal Opportunity Cell and the SCST Cell at EFLU have organized this solemn and commemorative event at a critical time in our nation's history. It is fair to say that a comprehensive review and reassessment of Dr. Ambedkar's place in the intellectual and political inheritance of the nation is currently underway. We could take many points as evidence to this claim. The emergence of new biographies, the new critical texts engaging with Dr. Ambedkar's work, as well as the political discourse that has emerged around Dr. Ambedkar. One could look at the last election, look beyond. Clearly, there is a deeper engagement with that historical personality and his work. Simultaneous to this re-emergence of Dr. Ambedkar in intellectual and political sense, we are engaged in a rethinking, substantial rethinking of the meaning and the consequences of the Constitution of India, 1950. The invitation to speak here today allows me to address how these two contemporary developments, the concern with Dr. Ambedkar's work and the concern with the Constitution, may influence each other and highlight some key lessons that we may learn for the near future. So, Dr. Raju Nayak was very kind with the introduction. What he didn't say, and maybe I should say at the start, is that I've done a fair bit of work on the Ambedkar corpus and on legal materials on these issues. And unfortunately, I was saying to the Vice Chancellor, I have not published as much as I'd like to. And so the invitation is an opportunity for me to just work with some of these ideas in a manner that is slightly exploratory. I will partly read and partly digress, and hopefully in the next 25-30 minutes, I will give enough material for all of you to ask me questions for which I may not have answers. So let me start. I'll begin my talk with a recent provocation, which I'm sure many of you might have already seen, but I will try and analyze it in a particular way. Yogendra Yadav, in a recent opinion editorial piece published in the Indian Express a few days ago, presses us to recover the radical in Ambedkar. He advises us against the recovery of Ambedkar as a conventional left or communist radical. He says, in the manner that Anantil Tumde and Yengde and others attempt in their recent edited collection. So this is the first caution he has. He says recovery as a radical, but not as a conventional left-wing radical. He also cautions that such a recovery should not be conceived as an academic project, but as the most pressing intellectual and political projects of our time. As a card-carrying member of the academic community, I would argue that a vigorous academic engagement with Dr. Ambedkar's work will at best enhance and certainly not diminish the intellectual and political projects of our time. I hope. But let's try and understand why Yogendra Yadav cautions against such an academic project. I take his criticism to be critical of the obtuse and sometimes unhelpful linguistic formats of academic discourse, some academic discourse. And I suppose that he is inviting us to retain a plain speaking clarity. Clarity that allows us, when we are wrong, to be wrong clearly. So, clarity over obtuseness. So, as I said, this is what I can do. I can do some engaged, both academic and legal work around Dr. Ambedkar's work, which is what I will try and do. Why does Yogendra Yadav think that this task is urgent or critical? So he thinks that we should engage the radical in Ambedkar at this point because such a recovery of the radical in Ambedkar is intertwined with the mission of reclaiming our constitutional democracy. By raising the stakes in this way, that it's not just about the recovery of the radical in Ambedkar, but it's about constitutional democracy itself, the piece somewhat echoes my second motivation to be here today and to be speaking with you. As a student of constitutional law and politics in India and beyond, I hope to spend the rest of my time addressing three elements of Dr. Ambedkar's lessons to contemporary India, which is celebrating its 75th constitutional anniversary. The three elements that I want to focus on are familiar elements, I think, to many of you who have worked with these materials, but I trust I will say something interesting, maybe even something different from what you might have seen before. The first is the idea of constitutional morality. Now, I know that the constitutional morality theme, some might argue, is a bit overdone, and I'm going to resist a particular way of reading constitutional morality that is the standard way of making the argument about what Ambedkar might have meant in this context. Second, I want to say something about democracy. And it is clear in recent discussion that the relationship between a liberal and a republican democracy, or some might say a social democracy, is one that we must both ask and answer in India and beyond. Because, dare I say, that the question of politics after Trump frames the question of liberal democracy in these urgent terms. What is the purpose of democracy? What is a defensible purpose of democracy? The third is also a theme that I'm sure many in this room are already familiar with, which is Ambedkar's position on the question of fraternity. Now, here too, there has been some useful interventions, both in political theory and constitutional law. And I'm going to suggest that a particular reading of the fraternity problem might allow us to see a certain connection between the range of work that makes up the Ambedkar corpus that might throw some new light, a new way of thinking about that corpus. In all of these three themes, I hope I'll at least be able to alert all of us to something new, slightly novel, in the way that Ambedkar approaches these questions and the way we can benefit from approaching these questions. So let me start with constitutional morality. In the constitutional morality discussion, and I think many people in this room are familiar with the constitutional morality question, constitutional morality has come to stand for the opposite of a public morality, meaning public conventional morality. What do people think is morally valid or not? And constitutional morality is the opposite of. It's something other than what popular morality might mean. The other idea that is strong in constitutional law, recent cases decided by the Supreme Court, is that constitutional morality comprises a set of core values that might be distilled in the Constitution. And we can look at a set, some might say democracy, secularism, federalism, or some other set, and that these values operate as a counterpoint, the core values that everything else in the Constitution and in social and political life must give way to. Now, these are the two dominant ideas that have emerged in recent times. And I want to go back to the root of this constitutional morality question. I think, again, there is a fair familiarity that this discussion of constitutional morality begins from debates in the Constituent Assembly towards the end of the constitution making process. Ambedkar, significantly, though others responded, invoked a concept of constitutional morality. What is less well known, and there's a particular reason why it's less well known, because the initial article on this point, which was published by the Seminar magazine, I can go into it, I won't drag everyone into academic arcana, but there was an article published which took a view of constitutional morality, which somehow has developed in a particular way and taken hold in the Indian discourse. I want to go back, though, to the debates in the teaching. What is the debate about? Why a discussion on constitutional morality? Ambedkar is asked the question as to why the Constitution of India's second draft is so long. He's asked the question, why the detail that you find in the debates about who is a governor, what are the eligibility conditions of a governor, how should the session be conducted, how should a bill be introduced, what is first reading, second reading, all of it. Why is this in the Constitution? Could it not just be left, write a shorter Constitution, maybe 100 or 150 articles, why 370? To this argument, Ambedkar responds. And Ambedkar responds in this manner. So let me just read so that I'm very clear as to how I understand this part of the debate. He says this. Yeah, okay. Let me just get the right. He says that for a constitution, let me just, sorry, I'll keep it short. He quotes George Grote, the non-academic, not a very academic, historian of Greece, who publishes with a banker's son who apprenticed learning Greek, and wrote about various aspects of Greek history. And he quotes Grote in this sense. He says the diffusion of constitutional morality, not merely among the majority of of any community, but throughout the whole, is the indispensable condition of a government at once free and peaceable. Since even any powerful and obstinate minority may render the working of a free institution impracticable without being strong enough to conquer ascendancy for themselves. By constitutional morality, Grote meant a paramount reverence for, and I emphasize, the forms of the Constitution, enforcing obedience to authority, acting under and within these forms, yet combined with the habit of open speech, of action subject only to definite legal control. And now this is Ambedkar in his own terms. This was the excerpted part. While anybody recognizes the necessity of the diffusion of constitutional morality for the peaceful working of a democratic constitution, there are two things interconnected with it which are not unfortunately generally recognized. One is that the form of administration has a close connection with the form of the constitution. The form of the administration must be appropriate to and in the same sense as the form of the constitution. The other is that it is perfectly possible to pervert the constitution without changing its form, by merely changing the form of the administration and make it inconsistent and opposed to the spirit of the constitution. Grote was not concerned with founding constitutional values. Grote was concerned with the transition of Greek democracy from unstable roots towards a more stable form. To be very complicated, it was about the rise and the fall and the second rise of a Greek democracy. I don't want to take our conversation to Greece, but Grote's question was, what should be in a constitution? Is the point of constitution writing to write about big values, democracy, secularism, equality, social justice? Or is the point of the constitution to write about the forms of institutional life? On this, Ambedkar was very clear about the lesson to be learned. The lesson to be learned from Grote was that to establish a democracy, a constitution, in an inhospitable society meant that you needed to write a very long constitution. Because in a society that is inhospitable, politically and socially, to these values, at the earliest and first instance, the form of the constitution will remain the same, but the administration of politics will change the meaning of the constitution. This is the problem that Ambedkar sought to address as the problem of constitutional morality. Yogendra Yadav in the piece that I referenced correctly notes that Ambedkar is more attentive to the problem of political and social consequences of different kinds of institutional designs. What is the effect of constitutional design on the possibility of a future politics? Ambedkar correctly learns from Grote that the impact of designs on the society is significant. That is, even when social, economic, and political conditions are inhospitable to constitutional ideas, write a very detailed constitution, a very detailed grammar for politics, and leave less open. That is his response. The Indian debate on constitutional morality has tended to focus, as the recent discussion on same-sex marriage has, on the meaning and impact of Article 17 of the Constitution, and whether the idea of untouchability must extend beyond the frame of caste to embrace other kinds of marginalities, and what is the range and application, say, of Article 17. You might also notice that in the recent decision making on the Sabrimala case, Article 17 has come to the fore as to questions of touch and access in religious spaces. I am not today suggesting that constitutional morality is somehow not to be invoked in this way. I'm only suggesting that if we lose track of the critical question that Ambedkar was forcing us to reckon with in that speech, we run the risk that we don't understand what constitutional morality might mean in 2025. In 2025, as much as we must be concerned with the substantive values that animate the Constitution and the various, we all have our chosen priority lists, I'm sure. If we don't need to lose any of our convictions about those values, but what is fundamental and critical to appreciate is that a failure to engage with the preservation of the forms of constitutionalism will leave us susceptible to the core mistake that Ambedkar thought that his critics who argued for a shorter constitution were making. In hospitable social and political conditions, we can rely on soft normativity, cultural norms, social norms, to do the work of preservation of the grammar of political life. But when in a society the soft norms of social and cultural life cannot do that work, Ambedkar was categorical that we must place emphasis on the hard structures of constitutional regimes to deliver. That was the insight that drove the argument on constitutional morality, and I'm going to suggest that that is the critical idea of constitutional morality that we need to dive far deeper into and preserve at this moment. This relationship, and I move to my second point, this relationship between the social and the political is an issue that has animated much of Dr. Ambedkar's work across time and across the range of issues that he has addressed. One of these issues was the question of democracy. Now, for Dr. Ambedkar, the earliest engagement with the problem and the ideas of democracy as a matter of social practice was to devise models of representation. As we are all aware, the push for group electorates in the first instance, separate electorates in the second, and finally the model of representation that was settled in the Constitution of India, which is reserved seats with a general electorate, were all issues that Dr. Ambedkar engaged with at great length, participated in those negotiations, and found differing outcomes, maybe not ideal outcomes, but outcomes that given time and place were what could be secured. But Ambedkar did more than just working the mechanics and the forms of representation, because he engaged deeply with the question of the purpose of democracy. What do we have democracy for? What ends should it serve? Is it enough that if we follow the forms of democracy, let's say representative elections, that democracy becomes a legitimate political format? And to this question, Ambedkar had a reasonably clear and articulate position. Ambedkar suggests that legitimate order for a political system to be legitimate, it must be a form and method of government whereby revolutionary changes in the economic and social life of the people are brought about without bloodshed. Now, this use of the word revolutionary might suggest a certain affinity, as some have argued, with a communist or even a Marxist revolutionary model. But Ambedkar's emphasis throughout in these discussions is on whether the Indian experiment with the problem of democracy can somehow reorder the conventional political theory on the chronology and the sequence between political revolutions, social revolutions, and constitutional revolutions. In the standard chronology, the constitutional revolution occurs last. Once you have carried out the tasks of political and social revolution, standard model being revolutionary France, at that point you might choose a constitutional form. Ambedkar suggests that for India to survive as a society and as a viable political society, this order has to be reversed. The order has to be reversed so much that we first adopt a constitutional form, we adopt constitutional rule of law, and then without bloodshed enact a political, economic, and a social revolution. This model of democracy and constitutionalism was novel. It was novel not just in the political traditions of Europe, but also within the political debates that were occurring in the Indian subcontinent. This idea that political constitutional regimes can bootstrap to rebuild a society suggests great potential to constitutional and legal form. Now, Ambedkar was no legal fetishist. He didn't think that writing something down in a constitutional document was a magic wand that would automatically change society. I don't think there was that element of what gets called in contemporary academic discourse as legal fetishism. That was not him. Then was it idle hope? Was it hope that somehow the Indian constitutional experiment would deliver political, economic, and social revolution without bloodshed under constitutional norms? This model, where does it come from? Where does Ambedkar think that, what kind of support can we get for this kind of intuition? Now, the book by Stroud on Dewey has published a few years ago, has received a fair bit of attention. Again, I'm sure that the scholars in the room who work on these materials are very familiar with it, particularly Stroud's mining of the Ambedkar marginalia, of the comments in various books and books that he has read and ideas that he has developed. And Stroud, for one, argues that this model of democracy that Ambedkar develops and then brings to Indian constitution making is one that is sharply influenced by the Columbia philosopher Dewey, and that essentially what we are seeing is Dewey's working out of the relationship between the liberal democracy and social ends. I, for one, think that we must look beyond the Dewey model, because Ambedkar's intuitions about democracy and about the place of individual civic participation and the foundational preconditions for democratic life to be possible draw far more strongly from Republican. When we say Republican here, we don't mean Republican in the party sense, in the American Republican Party sense, but Republican in the philosophical sense of strong systems of anti-hierarchy models of politics. I'm thinking here about Philip Pettit and others, not contemporaries of Ambedkar, not anyone that Ambedkar read, but people we might read to engage and develop what is this model of democracy that Ambedkar seeks to institutionalize in the constitutional form. The idea that democracy should be pre-committed, and I want to make this one last clarification before I move on from this, which is that there are some who argue that Ambedkar sees democracy as only being legitimate if it achieves and delivers certain ends. There is a very illuminating debate in the Constituent Assembly about whether the Indian Constitution is a socialist or a communist constitution. Ambedkar is charged with the idea that especially Part 4 of the Constitution, Articles 37, 38, and 39, are restatements of socialist or communist principles, and by placing them in Part 4 of the Constitution and mandating that the state must achieve these principles, essentially he gets asked the question in the Constituent Assembly, what is left then for democratic politics? If the Constitution determines the methods of politics, and if the Constitution determines the ends of politics, what is left for politics? There's nothing left. To that, Ambedkar has a sharp and intuitive response. He says that the job of a constitution is not to prescribe ends. He says that 37, 38, and 39, 37 being the gateway principle, and 38 and 39 being the substantive principles, are principles that shape the choice structures in politics, how we make choices. But they are not about substantive. They are not a prescription for a socialist or a communist model of government. Ambedkar's position, it seems, at that point resembles more, is more akin to a neutrality to ends that a standard liberal democratic model might presuppose. But clearly that is not the full story. If we stay with the idea that Ambedkar just put in place the standard liberal democratic model, we lose the intuition of the radical content that Ambedkar presupposes the Indian Constitution to be able to achieve. Now, notice here that I'm trying to suggest two different things on the democracy question. First, that Ambedkar is not predetermined about the ends of democracy per se. So he's not saying that the Indian Constitution is much like the Soviet Constitution, the Constitution of the USSR, in that everything is decided in the Constitution. Who wins the election might not matter very much. To Ambedkar, it does matter a lot. But for Ambedkar, the preconditions of a liberal democracy demand that the basic social conditions that make active Republican participation in politics is a given. This is non-negotiable. These baseline conditions for Ambedkar generate a different model of constitutionalism, a model of constitutionalism that is pre-committed to this basic welfare while being neutral as to other ends that politics can be engaged with. This approach to thinking about the nature of the relationship between constitutions and society is novel, not particularly well understood in political theory, but also by the court. The Indian Supreme Court in the 1950s falters repeatedly on the question of the place of the directive principles, tries to correct its position in the late 80s and the early 90s, and it does it in a very roundabout sort of way. And clearly, even at this point, this question, in 75 years after independence, this question of the relationship between the Constitution and the choices we made there and the form of democracy is critical and relevant today. The third point that I suggested that we should spend some time on is the arguments relating to fraternity. Now, there is a sharp piece of, and I'm just using it as a foil, or the Yogendra Yadav opinion editorial, which suggests that a recovery of the radical in Ambedkar must be a shift from Ambedkar's critique of the caste order to his legacy as a theorist of democracy. So essentially that we should pivot away the focus of attention that Ambedkar's critique of caste is about and focus on his arguments about democracy. I get the intuition, the motivation for such a shift, but I'm going to suggest that it misunderstands one key element of the way Ambedkar sets up the key values in a political democracy. Now, the fraternity conversation has drawn significant literature in the last 5, 7, maybe 10 years. And there are many variants of that literature, and for the purposes of precision and being concise, I will not track every one of them and name the various arguments on fraternity and why and what. What is striking to me is Ambedkar's constant resort to arguments about the relationship between the social and the political in any society. For Ambedkar, social preconditions are more important. They come prior in time and they come higher in the order of priority than the political practices and the political values that we espouse. In the standard three-part liberty, equality, fraternity triad, there is in Western political theory a significant debate about whether liberty comes first and equality next, and so on and so forth. And all those working on these kinds of questions and reading John Rawls would appreciate that there are attempts to reconcile the two. But notice in Rawls's reconciliation, which I'll just take to be the classic reworking in Western political theory from the 1980s onwards, the two nodal points of reconciliation are liberty and equality. Rawls's two principles of justice essentially work on the ordering of liberty and equality. Whereas fraternity, for fraternity, we would turn to look again to Ambedkar's Marginalia, the small notes he makes on various books. It is clear that Ambedkar read Dewey on fraternity, but also Rousseau. And the reference to the French political theorist and philosopher was to rework the relationship between the social and the political. So for Ambedkar, commensality, common dining, and consanguinity, common marriage, were seen as strategies that go with, if not prior, to arguments about liberty and equality. Now, it might seem, as Yogendra Yadav suggests, that concerns with social order and caste may be detached from concerns with political order, democracy, liberty, and equality. But for Ambedkar, the social basis or the social practice that forms the foundation for a practice of political values suggests that this detachment is not possible. Now, for those of us who engage in the intricacies of institutional life at universities like this or elsewhere, we understand that bridging these kinds of social barriers draw out the fiercest, most vociferous reactions in institutional life. It's remarkable. I think it's true for those who've had to work with these kinds of concerns, that what is it about these forms of social ordering that draw out such sharp reactions and commentary? For Ambedkar, once again, like the discussion about the relationship between democracy and social revolution, the relationship between liberty, equality, and fraternity was not just a relation, not just a question of chronology and sequence. It's not that first you achieve liberty, then you achieve equality so long as you preserve liberty, and then you achieve fraternity so long as you preserve liberty and equality. For Ambedkar, the question was inverted. He suggests that unless we can reorder society along fraternal lines, the conditions of liberty and equality do not exist. This is not a question of getting the timing right. This is a question of the relationship between values, where the pursuit of liberty and equality are parasitic on the ability to realize, at least in its basic forms, models of fraternity. So let me try and conclude, try and tie these together. So in my mind, when we look at India in 2025, the problems of constitutional maintenance and political vibrancy are urgent. I don't think that the opinion editorial on the 131st birth anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar is wrong in pointing at this urgency. I think that's absolutely right. We may go further. We may go further to say that this urgency is not just Indian. This urgency can be seen in political liberal democracies that have a far deeper traditions than ours, existed for 200 years or something like that. In this case, the United States and many parts of Europe. What is it about our movement that makes this churning in liberal constitutional democracies take place all over the world at this point? It seems to me, and on this I'm not going to rely on anybody else or try and quote from somewhere. It seems to me that in the long run that liberal democracies, constitutional democracies have had with great success as a form of government, they face a unique crisis at this point. And that crisis emerges from a common core. And that core is the problem of fraternity. So long as liberal democracies have toggled with the relative priority of liberty and equality, and have left fraternity and questions of social ordering to be worked out by social and cultural norms, that path seems to have run its course. Across the world and in India, the urgency of engagement with this question suggests, and so I hope I persuade some of you in the room, that we reorder our architecture of concepts and values around democracy, around the liberty, equality, and fraternity triad, and our understanding of the nature of constitutional forms, the value of constitutional forms by themselves, standing alone, to organize the grammar of everyday life. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, sir. Such a wonderful and thought-provoking speech. We'll come back to it, but as our Honorable Vice Chancellor suggested, that let's go for the Q&A and listen from the audience, and then we'll come back to it. Yeah. Now the session is open for the question and suggestions.
Yeah, thank you, sir. It was a wonderful talk that was delivered. So it's not actually a question, but some comments, some reflections of what you presented. So it is true that out of these three Trinity principles, equality, liberty, fraternity, as Ambedkar kept fraternity as the core principle, because liberty to have a to enable liberty, there has to be social equality, and other forms of equality have to be there as a precondition, and then he could analyze the unique social system that required treatment through fraternity. But recently, while reading Ambedkar's writings on democracy, that one of the speech that that speech I felt very important in terms of defining democracy. That one of the speeches that he delivered at Pune, Law Library. It's very interesting speech. He speaks about the functional democracies. What are the prerequisites of functional democracy? That as he says that democracy is a form of government that resolves differences through discussion or governance through discussion. That's a unique thing. I mean, unlike monarchies where power transfer happens through bloodshed, but here the democracy is a form of government where discussion is very central to. So in that context, that he says that one of the important principles of democracy is that the vibrant opposition party. So vibrant opposition party because people have only veto every 5 years, but being a vibrant political opposition that can act as a veto everyday veto, and then it can highlight failure on the part of government. Apart from that, there are other, as you mentioned, that constitutional morality. That's very important. It keeps constitutional morality over constitution itself. These are unwritten kind of conventions that he talks about. He gives this example of George Washington, who refused to contest for third time because he feels that after all we have fought against the monarchy, then even though I am immensely popular, then I'm not going to contest for the third time. I think these are unwritten kind of convention that he mentions. So thank you for delivering such a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Can I just pick up on one element of what you said, which is the Pune speech that you referred to? That reference is a very close reference to Dewey's work. and I just want to emphasize it to make a point of distinction between what I was pressing at and where Dewey goes. So Dewey argues the precise point. He says that the point of democracy is deliberation. Deliberation by the jousting of reasons produces better outcomes. Deliberative democracy, as that phrase then gets used, will produce better outcomes, and this emphasis on better outcomes gets phrased in the U.S. debates on the progressive movement in politics as a kind of pragmatism, right? So the Stroud book uh, works through some of these ideas, and I think on these questions it's very accurate. It's accurate that clearly for Dr. Ambedkar, the position on deliberative democracy and pragmatism is an important position. And to that extent, Dewey is committed to a non-dogmatic view of politics, that no one has a monopoly over the best outcomes in politics. And Ambedkar, to a certain extent, embraces that view. So, and I think there's value in that. But I suppose that the element that I'm pushing at a little bit is to try and go a little beyond the Stroud position. You know, while Ambedkar does look at the Dewey deliberative democratic model as being important, he has a view about the relationship between democracy and the social, which goes beyond Dewey, is what I'm trying to urge today.
Taking a cue from your reference to Yogendra Yadav's article in the Indian Express, defining constitutional morality, is it just best left to the judiciary, or should there be some kind of engagement with the ground below, with other democratic processes?
So clearly, I'm a lawyer by training, and I teach in a law school. So you might expect me to say that we should leave it to the courts, and I'm not going to say that for the reason that the court's invocation of constitutional morality is almost orthogonal to the way that Dr. Ambedkar invokes constitutional morality. It's completely wrong. At least I'm not saying that you can't use the phrase constitutional morality in the way the court uses it. You can use any phrase in any way so long as you're clear and you have a defense of it. But it is clearly wrong in its invocation of Dr. Ambedkar as an example of that constitutional morality. So let me make a point of distinction. The recent judgment on governance last week by the Honorable Supreme Court has much more to do with the question of the forms of democracy and the forms of a constitution in the constitutional morality sense than some of the earlier work. I'm not suggesting that if you use it for one, you should not use it for the other. I'm just saying that if, as a court and as a political tradition engaging seriously with Dr. Ambedkar's work, we recognize that the reference to Grote and the reference to constitutional morality has a very important insight. The insight is that the forms of constitutions and the forms of institutional life have an outsized bearing on political and social outcomes in a society. And for me, the recent governor's decision bears that out. We have to pay attention to the kind of arcania. People say, like, who cares about governor's discretion? Maybe governor has discretion, maybe governor doesn't have discretion. These are all sort of boring topics. They are the boring topics that make up the substance of our collective lives. So that's my sense, and I think the loss in the constitutional morality debate is that we talk about some big values and we lose the essential insight of that comment on the closing of the Indian Constitution, which is how do you institutionalize democratic political life when the soft cultural and social norms of a society are inhospitable to it. His answer is you write a long constitution and then you stick to that constitution, right? And it's a sort of a investment in that form, which I think in the 75th year of the Republic, in our times, we would do very well to go back to that idea that we invest in that question of constitutional and political form. There's a great payoff, and I think with all the caveats that we might enter, we have benefited from the payoff of 75 years of constitutional democratic politics in this country. And if we want to maintain that, the recognition of the value of form. We may disagree about many other things, in everyday politics, but can we all agree that that constitutional form, which we have inherited, is worth that investment in and of itself? That's the point that I would like to make.
Yeah, hi, Professor. It was wonderful talk. Some of the part went beyond the mind, but what I felt from this talk is about like it's a little bit limited to the audience, maybe little bit limited to the era, the age we are discussing, 2025. When you are pointing out something beyond, the use model of democracies, something you are saying is beyond. What I feel is what Ambedkar's model of democracy, which is giving a theoretical foundation to the social revolution when he's discussing the idea when he's discussing in revolution and counter-revolution in India, talking about Indian history is a mortal conflict between Brahmanism and Buddhism. So recently, to start ideas of use pragmatism and all, Jadamoni Mohan, there is a scholar who writes critical review on it. He says that this is putting Ambedkar into use ideas of democracy or pragmatism is very limited because Ambedkar's theoretical foundation on the social revolution, which comes from Buddhism, Buddha's concept of Bahujan Nitaya and Bahujan Sukhaya when he's writing his Buddha and his Dharma. So what I felt when I'm talking that this talk is a bit limited because I am not a student of the legal or juridical part, but we should at least discuss about something which deal with the idealization of caste approach. Because what I feel in contemporary time, anybody can write, anybody can have their Instagram bio, WhatsApp bio as anti-caste thinker, but nobody says that they are part of annihilation of caste movement. I feel personally Ambedkar is a radical figure from 1936 when he is writing Annihilation of Caste. This book is not undelivered speech. How do you see this? Even Yogendra Yadav writing is emphasized more on constitutional morality and perceived that some thought I also have that it's very limited. He's just trying to put it to a political reformation or political transformation, but not discussing about social democracy. Democracy in a sense, again, I put it into like it's not a mere form of government, but a modes of associated living, which is emphasizing as fraternity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. Let me start with your last conclusion. So I hope there was not too much of what I said that was not accessible to you, but your last conclusion was where I started, which is that the idea that the piece captures, which is that we can detach the question of the criticism of social order. You use the phrase annihilation of caste, which could be another way of getting at the same question, and the question of political order, that we can detach these questions and that we should really focus now on Ambedkar as a political theorist of democracy, is the position that Yadav advances. And I just use it as a foil. I'm not treating it as an academic argument. It's a opinion editorial, and I know the conditions under which opinion editorials are written, so it's okay. But I think it allows us to make that point of contrast. Can we detach the two questions? And I've suggested today, much like you have, that we can't. Now, the thing with the Ambedkar corpus, and I'm just going to say something more generically about intellectual work, is that the corpus is very vast. And different people have focused on different parts of the corpus, early, middle, late. Uh, some people would argue that the early work should have some precedence, and some people argue later work in other ways, and so on and so forth. And those are very relevant, but slightly abstract academic conversations. I haven't addressed any of those today. I haven't tried to go at those questions. On questions of revolution and counter-revolution and the question of Buddhism, it's a very important question. That, to take Jadamani's argument on Stroud, that Stroud recasts Ambedkar's work along Dewey lines, and that we should look at it more as a derivative work of, say, a Buddhist philosophical approach. My instinct, and I'll just say this more generally, that whether I would work on Dr. Ambedkar or on Gandhi or anybody else, that I don't see the need for that polarity. My sense here is that we have a deep danger in our political, intellectual, and cultural lives, which is a lapse into a form of indigeneity, a claim that somehow indigenous instincts were either prior to or more important than other things that a scholar or Dr. Ambedkar might have engaged with. And my approach to these questions is not to go at the question like that. It doesn't really matter to me whether the original insight was Buddhist and came from the Pali canon, or whether it came from Dewey, and whether it came from that strand, or how they come together. I think there's value in trying to understand and unpack that up to a point. But I would not drive that as the main point of either academic or intellectual analysis. Yes, we must try and understand as best we can, but Dr. Ambedkar uh, clearly was drawing on these various traditions and practicing the politics, right? And we have all of that corpus to make sense of. And yes, we can have some reasonable disagreements about whether it's the Pali canon that is the original idea, or whether it was Dewey, and it matters only up to a point. That's the kind of, so my view on these questions is to be more ecumenical about intellectual sources. Arguments of purity bother me, and I think should bother many of us in the room. If we say that, we should all be indigenous in our ascriptions of where we learn what we learn, um, it's an odd direction to push in our times, and it's not a direction I push in at all. I'm very happy to be cosmopolitan about sources. Yes, some things we learn from the Pali canon, some things we learn from Dewey. That's okay. We learn like that. That's how Dr. Ambedkar learned. Uh, we would not do too badly to follow that tradition.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for the intellectually stimulating talk. I was thinking about the whole talk as a kind of, in my own mind, it's like trying to figure out the relationship among these three. The first one is the textual form of the Constitution. Second one is the political form. Perhaps you can also say that the institutional form of democracy, and the third one being the political form of politics, if you want to put it that way. The first one I thought is the relationship between the textual form and the institutional form, which Ambedkar was quite aware of two things. I thought it also came well into our presentation. The first one is that in other occasions, Ambedkar says that the mere law cannot function if there is a community to defend that law. Right? There is a way in which Ambedkar's imagination of law is aware that the law cannot function when the soil is not quite cooperative with the law. Right? That's the one understanding. Second understanding, Ambedkar is also quite acutely aware of uh, the how law functions. Right? In a sense, the law should address not only what is the antagonisms of what is apparently available today, but what are the forthcoming antagonisms, eventually what can emerge. Perhaps the law should have a vision of all that. Perhaps Ambedkar is thinking in those lines. The second point that you brought in terms of relationship between forms of uh, form of political form and the forms of politics. I have a question. That in the recent scholarship, there has been writings about the idea of resurrection in Ambedkar. Right? It's not simply about the constitutional law. There is also thinking about resurrection. So I have a question: that is it possible that the forms of uh, the political form can be imagined in such a way that it can exhaust all possibilities of political forms. Right? So in a way that constitution can actually resolve all the problems and there is no need for politics. That's the view. About the third one is about the relationship between liberty, equality, and fraternity. So what I thought in my mind, Ambedkar's distinct thinking about the relationship between equality and fraternity, equality and liberty, is that in the Western tradition, there has been a largely, whether it is liberal or the radical tradition, the way the relationship between liberty and equality is always imagined not necessarily as a complementary relationship. But whereas in Ambedkar from 1930s text of annihilation of caste to the later texts, something like Buddha and Marx, there is clearly thinking about this relationship as a complementary kind of relationship, which is quite, I think, innovative from the established traditions of political theory, whether it is a liberal or the radical theory. That's a comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm not sure that I'm on top of all the three comments. So I'll just try to respond in the best way that I can and what I understood, and maybe some might be a little sideways. On that first question of the promise of law, Ambedkar is very clear that in Indian society we function under a rubric where uh, caste ordering was law. Right? So social ordering had the effect of law, very strident forms of law. Yes, it was socially enforced, might not have been enforced by a political state, but violently so and offensively so. So for in that tradition where in a tradition like ours, where social ordering reinforces caste for millennia, uh, for for, uh, for that period with consistency and force, what can get us away from it? And his pivot there is to the idea of a modern law. So he doesn't give up entirely on the project of lawmaking or legal interventions in the social. He thinks, in fact, that it is the antidote to caste ordering and law. So he has this idea that we make a mistake of thinking that the caste system is just a social system. He says no, it's a socially enforced legal order. And what we replace it with is a modern legal order enforced by political authorities driven by different values. So that polarity and that clarity I get from reading the Ambedkar canon, and he has faith in law in a way that, say, in the Indian political tradition, Gandhi has less faith. Okay? So Gandhi has less faith in the modern law project. Uh, Ambedkar certainly has faith in it, as does Nehru. And it's an unlikely coalition, some might say, but it is a coalition that worked and delivered a model of the constitution and a model of a modern legal system. On the second point, I'm not I'm not sure what you mean by resurrection. So I'm not sure what you're pointing at when you say resurrection. But is it that the Constitution can resolve all future antagonisms and all future conflicts? Is the way I sort of understood the question. And I think that the Constitution viewed as a political grammar that allows for this kind of deliberative problem solving with a clarity that the social preconditions to deliberation must be achieved first rather than accepting all deliberative outcomes. I think I know there's a debate that, but Ambedkar disavowed the constitution, and so I know that there is that debate, but I would still persist with the claim that that is an idea that he holds closely, that constitutions in this form can do this work. Do you say, is this magic? I think, yeah, it's the closest we have to magic in social and political life. We can develop institutional forms that can deliver far better outcomes than anything else we know. So, and I think that's his intuition, and you can tell from my enthusiasm that that's an intuition that I'm very happy to endorse. And I'll just make one last point to the question of equality, liberty, and fraternity. Yes, there is a deep debate in Western political theory about whether liberty and equality are complementary or conflictual, and there are, as you can imagine, many arguments going one way and the other. But the predominant idea or predominant concern in political theories, how can you adequately reconcile the liberty equality question? For Dr. Ambedkar, this question was very clear. And let's look at the temple entry question. For Dr. Ambedkar, the question was, if communities could claim, as they did in the temple entry civil rights cases, that they had the autonomy to decide who would enter into their communal spaces, that was a liberty argument of individuals and a liberty argument of closed groups. The contrast and the conflict is apparent and clear to anyone to see. If we take the liberty interest of the temple group to be primary, then the equality or a fraternity concern will come second or third in that list. What should courts do? What should legal systems do? So that conflict in Dr. Ambedkar's thinking and work is apparent. It's explicit. It's not just in the realms of conceptual thinking. As a matter of practice, one had to make an argument about why the liberty interests of a religious group could not trump other interests, other political values. So my sense there is that hence the reordering of the structure of the three values. Because if you start with the idea that liberty comes first, equality comes second, and we can achieve fraternity provided we protect liberty and equality, then we are stuck. We are stuck in a society like ours, which has transiently for a long period of time sustained a form of social ordering that makes the pursuit of liberty and equality meaningless by ensuring that fraternity has no purchase. Right? So he gets that problem, which is why he reorders that structure. And I think that's the useful way to look at it.
One last question.
Dear Professor, the first thing I would like to say is thank you for this wonderful talk. I would like to hear your comments on the following. The first one is on growing popularity of Ambedkar at the global level, the reasons for his growing popularity. And the second one, the politics behind restricting or confining Ambedkar to certain sections of the society or certain communities of the society for all these years. And the third, we consider Amartya Sen as the great economist, and he considers Ambedkar as his guru in economics. So today, in current scenario, we are talking about seeing India as the third largest economy in the world. So your comments on Ambedkar contributions in economics, because this we don't often discuss. We talk about all his contributions in every spectrum, but we don't talk much about his contributions in economics and economy. So your comments.
So, thank you very much. Three really quite different questions, but maybe a common theme that runs through them is how we receive the Ambedkar corpus and how we understand it. Let me start with the third. Uh, while I don't want to draw strict disciplinary boundaries about what we can learn about and know well, I must admit that my understanding and familiarity with Dr. Ambedkar's work in economics is marginal. So I don't have a deep sense of either the London School of Economics doctoral thesis, which I have read, but it's not like I know economics to even hold out on whether it is a strong contribution or not. So on the economics question, I just have a modest point to make, which is that uh, I think it's Dr. Jadhav who has an interesting new biographical note in a series on the Azim Premji University website, which is on important economists in India, in which there's a biographical entry assessing Dr. Ambedkar's work from the field of economics. So that's my only contribution on the economics question. There's an interesting reading. I've learned much from it. I would just commend it to you and suggest that you take a look. I don't have any distinctive view on the economics question. On the question on whether we should see Dr. Ambedkar as a Dalit scholar, it's a point that Yogendra Yadav makes that we should see Dr. Ambedkar as a more as a scholar across fields and across communities and so on. There is no disagreement with that, but I want to make a slightly tangential but important disciplinary point, which is that for all of us who study law and political theory and politics, Ambedkar has never been presented in that tradition as a Dalit scholar. Right? So I have never read. I don't come to the text saying what is that Dr. Ambedkar presents a Dalit view of the Constitution. I mean, I don't teach like that, I don't write like that, and I don't read the text like that. But I take your point that in some fields, that's how Dr. Ambedkar gets written about. Uh, but luckily for me, the field that I work in and write in constitutional law and scholarship, that's not a problem. We treat Dr. Ambedkar's contributions in the field just like an engagement with all the other work that's in the field, and he does not get uh, typologized as a scholar of a particular community. As a general matter in Indian intellectual life, it would be very useful position for all of us to develop that we engage with people's ideas and contributions in an embedded way, but while at the same time being able to work away from that context. I think that applies to as much to Gandhi and Nehru. The kind of personalist political turn of the late 1990s in intellectual cultures pushed out so far in the direction that everyone is limited to their personal locations and they can only speak in some sense for that the limited coordinates of their life. I think it's a position that we would do well to moderate from, in my view. Um, the question on Ambedkar and the global sense, I mean, you're absolutely right that there is a much sharper and frankly, very widespread recognition that Ambedkar's scholarship uh, brings something to an understanding of India and this, this, this part of the world, but also more broadly constitutional traditions in across the world in a way that has simply not happened for 60 years. I'm sure that there's a very exciting intellectual history to be written there as to why that has happened. I'm sure that politics matters and um, some of that might reshape intellectual interests. I don't have a master thesis. I wish I could be glib and tell you it has happened because of this, but I don't have such a master account of why that international interest in Dr. Ambedkar's work has grown, except to say that it's timely and that it's timely in the sense that, in two senses, that it should have been done a long time ago, but given the crises that we have in liberal constitutional democracy today, it's timely that we go back to these texts and to these approaches at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Such an engaging session this is. Coming back to the question of recognition of Ambedkar, when I was in the University of Columbia, I just astonished to see the recognition that they have. They completely dedicated one hall for Ambedkar and kept his bust in the hall. It is not only that university, across the other universities also, they are trying to install Ambedkar's bust in each and every university to recognize and rethink on his contributions. That is an interesting thing. With this, now I invite our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Nagaraj, to give his remark on the talk.
I think hardly anything to remark about. First of all, let me thank Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy. When I rang him, he readily agreed, and one sentence he said, "That's one institute I wanted to visit since long time." And he came here. He came here, no frills, nothing. And you would be surprised to know, after he came, just after reaching the campus, he took a tour of the campus, maybe to know and understand. I don't know how much he understood because I have been here since 1 month. I understand very little. So, another thing he said, I think some of the faculty can help us. He wanted a kind of academic engagement with FU, EFL University. I think we should take forward, particularly in foreign languages. His institution is very keen, law university, and we are very keen to see law as a philosophy. We would like, EFL University would like to explore that part and see if it can be part of our courses being taught here. Professor Krishnaswamy, we look forward to. Either you are coming next time or I am going to you. One of that. Another thing I just wanted to tell Dr. Naik made a long introduction, but he didn't tell one thing. After he completed his doctorate, Professor Krishnaswamy was the professorial chair at Columbia University, probably on Ambedkar studies. You can see that there is a very organic link to that, And when he told about reading Ambedkar 2025, I had on two particular points I thought he would touch, but I think he had already taken a very structured and very logical talk. So probably that hasn't come into that orbit. First, if you see the Constituent Assembly debates and whatever Dr. Ambedkar has done, that's largely in the 40s. And in the 40s, if you also see the UN development, there is a discourse on rights. And I have a feeling, with time, I don't know whether I'm old enough to talk before a legal expert. Ambedkar anticipated some of the some of the aspects in discourse of rights. Probably the Article 19 that he talks about in the deal, it is more an anticipation of what all across the globe the discourse of rights was developing. That's one. The second point, which I think at a very academic and very intellectual level we need to talk about, whatever idea Ambedkar engaged with, he always saw that, he has seen that in the context of nation as a political organization. And he always felt that nation first, I think I quoted it enough, but why he has put nation above other political organizations, and whatever he did, maybe it is social reform or it's critique of the caste order, or maybe even as Professor Krishna Swami talked about the architecture of values, the three values. He always saw that in the context of the national political organization. These are some of the things 2025 asks us to think about. Maybe some other time. I'm very glad that so many of you have come and made this talk a success. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now I request our Honorable Vice Chancellor to felicitate Professor Krishna Swami. It's a token of love from our institute and SCST cell. Now I request Professor Shamrao Rathod to felicitate our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Nagaraj.
We're all insiders.
Yeah. Now we have come to a conclusion session with the vote of thanks. There are now words to express my thanks to the Honorable Vice Chancellor who had taken so much of interest in happening this session today. Not only inviting the eminent speaker who had delivered a wonderful talk today, and it is really an honor to have Professor Krishna Swami here. Thank you, sir, for being here, having taken a lot of strain to come here and delivering the wonderful lecture. It is thought-provoking and it is engaging, and many of us were really not even thinking of Constitution in a dimension that you were thinking, how we can engage with the Constitution and what are the essential elements that the Constitution actually provides to the people of this nation. And you rightly pointed out that it is not just for the certain sections of the people, it is for the entire nation, and every citizen of this people need to engage and reread and rethink on the Constitution. I also thank the SCST cell for organizing this wonderful talk today. I also thank our registrar, Professor Narasimha for helping the aspects of the things that we are struggling to materialize. And he was always there to help us in all the things that we are struggling to materialize. And I also thank all the EFLU University participants, MMRC and Publication Department, Dean CPD and Dean DSW and each and every participant of this session. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. And we also have IT there. Please kindly
participate in that. No, now here today, he is a liaison officer. So we also thanked him, and we also thank as a proctor of this university. Thank you so much.